You're doing it right now. You're here, but you're not really here. Part of you is already in tomorrow. Part of you is already in next week. Part of you is already in after this is done. You check the time, not because you need to know what time it is, because you're calculating how long until the next thing. You check your phone, not because something happened, because something might happen. You look at the calendar, not because today matters, because you're already living somewhere else. That's the strange part. Most people don't live in the present. They visit it, briefly, just long enough to prepare for wherever they're mentally going next. You keep telling yourself the important part is coming. After this week, after this project, after this problem, after this version of yourself. Life is always about to begin. And somehow, it never quite does. You live in a permanent state of almost there, almost ready, almost successful, almost happy, almost living. The future has become your permanent address. And the present keeps getting treated like a waiting room you never chose, a waiting room you forgot you were sitting in. I noticed something uncomfortable a while ago. The moments I spent waiting for were becoming more vivid than the moments I actually received. The anticipation felt alive. The arrival felt administrative, like collecting something I had already experienced in my head. Sometimes I would spend weeks imagining a future moment, then finally arrive there and immediately start waiting for the next one. That's when I started wondering, what if the waiting never ends? What if that's the thing we've mistaken for life? Waiting used to be a temporary condition. You waited for the bus. You waited for your birthday. You waited for summer. Then the waiting ended. Life resumed. Now something feels different. The waiting never leaves. One goal becomes another. One milestone becomes another. One countdown replaces another. You finish the project. Then you start thinking about the next one. You arrive at Friday. By Saturday afternoon, you're already thinking about Monday. You finally take the vacation. 3 days into it, part of your attention has already moved somewhere else. Not because the moment is bad, because your mind has been trained to live ahead of itself. You keep telling yourself that life is about to begin. After this deadline, after this purchase, after this promotion, after this move, after this relationship, after this problem is solved. The list changes. The pattern doesn't. The future keeps moving. You keep following it. And somewhere along the way, waiting stopped being something you did. It became somewhere you lived. You don't visit the future anymore. You rent an apartment there. You wake up there. You eat there. You make plans there. Meanwhile, the present keeps getting reduced to logistics. Something to get through, something to manage, something to optimize, something to survive until the next important thing arrives. That's why ordinary days start feeling strangely invisible. Not because nothing happened, because you treated the day as a bridge instead of a destination. A lot of life disappears that way. Not through tragedy, not through failure, through postponement. The strange thing is that waiting feels responsible. It feels productive. It feels ambitious. You can spend an entire day mentally preparing for tomorrow and still feel like you've done something meaningful. I know because I've done exactly that. The mind gives anticipation a sense of importance, sometimes more importance than the thing itself, and that's where the pattern starts becoming difficult to see, because it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like planning. It feels like progress. It feels like being serious about life, which makes it much harder to question. You can see the pattern most clearly in the way people talk about Friday. Not Friday itself, the idea of Friday. Monday becomes the thing you need to survive. Tuesday becomes evidence that you're getting closer. Wednesday becomes halfway. Thursday becomes anticipation. And Friday becomes the reward. 5 days spent mentally leaning toward 2. Then Sunday arrives, and the cycle resets. The strange part isn't that people enjoy weekends. The strange part is how much of life gets classified as not yet. You don't need a bad job for this to happen. You don't need an unhappy life. You don't even need a problem. You only need the belief that the important part is slightly ahead of where you are now. That belief is surprisingly powerful. It can turn an ordinary Tuesday into an obstacle. It can turn a quiet evening into dead time. It can turn today into something that only matters because it leads to tomorrow. The calendar starts behaving like a ladder. Every rung exists to reach the next one. Very few are allowed to be enough on their own. You tell yourself you'll relax after this week, then after this month, then after this project, then after this year. The destination changes. The sentence stays the same. And eventually you realize something uncomfortable. You've spent years preparing for a life that keeps moving further away every time you approach it. Not because life moved, because the target moved. The finish line has a strange habit. It travels at exactly the same speed as your expectations. That's why arrival feels so brief. You've been rehearsing the next chapter before finishing the current one. One of the most effective tricks the future ever played was convincing us that anticipation and progress are the same thing. They're not. Anticipation feels like movement. Progress creates movement. Those are different experiences. One changes your circumstances. The other changes your expectations. And expectations are difficult to satisfy because they immediately start looking for a new assignment. That's why some people spend years chasing relief and accidentally become professional waiters in their own lives. Not in restaurants. In time. You check the clock. Not because you're late, because you're waiting. The same habit returns. Different day, different goal, same movement. You glance at the time, then again 10 minutes later. Then again, an hour later. Nothing changed, but something keeps asking, how much longer? The question appears so often that it starts feeling normal. You stop noticing it. You stop questioning it. You simply assume that the thing you're waiting for must be important. Otherwise, why would you be thinking about it so much? That's where the trap becomes difficult to see, because attention feels like evidence. The more attention you give something, the more significant it appears. The future benefits from that illusion constantly. You think about the promotion, so it feels important. You think about the purchase, so it feels important. You think about the vacation, so it feels important. You think about the next version of your life, so it feels important. Meanwhile, the present receives almost no promotional campaign at all. Today doesn't advertise itself. This afternoon doesn't send reminders. This conversation doesn't arrive with a countdown timer. The future is loud. The present is quiet. Guess which one usually wins? The strange thing is that the finish line rarely delivers what the countdown promised, not because the goal was wrong, because anticipation inflated it. You spent weeks imagining the feeling, weeks rehearsing the reward, weeks building emotional interest on a loan that reality was never capable of repaying. Then the day arrives. The event happens. The package arrives. The message appears. The achievement becomes official. And reality walks into a room where anticipation has already been living for months. It's an unfair competition. Reality arrives once. Expectation arrived every day. Of course reality loses. Of course the feeling fades quickly. Of course another goal immediately appears. The system requires a new finish line, otherwise the waiting would stop. And if the waiting stopped, you might finally look around. The older I get, the more suspicious I become of the phrase, "I just need one more thing." Because that sentence has survived every completed goal I've ever had. One more thing, one more milestone, one more improvement, one more achievement. The finish line keeps moving with remarkable loyalty. It never abandons you. It simply relocates every time you arrive. The future has excellent public relations. That's part of the problem. Nobody questions ambition. Nobody questions growth. Nobody questions improvement. In fact, questioning them can sound irresponsible, almost suspicious, as if contentment itself became a character flaw. You can feel this pressure everywhere. Work harder, optimize more, level up, build, expand, scale, improve. The message arrives so often that eventually it stops sounding like advice. It starts sounding like a moral obligation. The strange result is that satisfaction begins to look lazy. You accomplish something, and before you can experience it, your attention has already been redirected toward the next objective. Not because someone forced you, because standing still starts feeling uncomfortable. Because completion creates a strange silence, and silence gives you an opportunity to notice something. You might already have enough. That possibility creates more discomfort than most people realize. Because if enough exists, then the chase becomes optional. And if the chase becomes optional, a lot of modern identities become difficult to maintain. That's why dissatisfaction has become surprisingly fashionable. Not visible dissatisfaction, polished dissatisfaction, productive dissatisfaction, ambitious dissatisfaction, the kind that receives applause, the kind that gets reposted, the kind that arrives disguised as wisdom. You call it ambition, but sometimes it's just dissatisfaction wearing a motivational quote. That's the part nobody puts on the poster. Nobody writes, "Never be happy with where you are." Nobody writes, "Treat every achievement as a temporary inconvenience." Nobody writes, "Turn your entire life into a waiting room." The language is always more elegant than that. The outcome often isn't. Because there is a difference between moving forward and refusing to arrive. One creates a future, the other permanently escapes the present. Those are not the same thing. And yet modern culture often packages them together. The person who pauses is told to accelerate. The person who arrives is told to upgrade. The person who is satisfied is told to aim higher. Eventually, a strange assumption emerges, that every moment should be used to reach another moment, as if existence itself requires constant justification, as if being here is never enough, as if every chapter exists only to serve the next one. One of the most uncomfortable realizations I've had is that goals are easy to defend. You can justify almost anything in the name of improvement. Exhaustion becomes discipline. Anxiety becomes preparation. Dissatisfaction becomes ambition. The labels sound different. The experience often doesn't. That's why this pattern survives so easily. It rarely presents itself as a problem. It presents itself as a virtue. And virtues are much harder to question. Eventually, the thing arrives. Not the abstract thing, the real thing. The promotion, the relationship, the apartment, the purchase, the vacation, the achievement. The moment you've been building toward for weeks, months, sometimes years. And for a brief period, it feels exactly the way you imagined. Relief, excitement, validation, proof that all the waiting meant something. Then something unexpected happens. The feeling begins to leave. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly, almost professionally, like it knows the procedure. The new phone becomes your phone. The new car becomes your car. The new title becomes your title. The dream vacation becomes a folder of photographs. The extraordinary becomes familiar. Again. That's the moment many people misunderstand. They assume they chose the wrong goal, the wrong city, the wrong relationship, the wrong career, the wrong purchase. So they begin searching for a replacement, a better version, a bigger version, a more exciting version. But the pattern keeps repeating. Because the problem was never the destination. The problem was the expectation that arrival would permanently change the experience of being you. That's a lot of responsibility to place on a future event. Almost impossible responsibility. No promotion can carry it. No relationship can carry it. No purchase can carry it. No vacation can carry it. Eventually, every destination collapses under the weight of expectations that were never designed to fit inside it. And then the search begins again. A new goal appears. A new countdown begins. A new promise quietly forms. This one will be different. That's how waiting survives. Not because arrival fails completely, because arrival succeeds just enough to keep the cycle alive. The reward doesn't disappear. It simply expires faster than expected. And expiration creates demand. Demand creates pursuit. Pursuit creates anticipation. Anticipation creates another future.
Pause. The machine restarts.
I've noticed something strange about goals. The closer they get, the less magical they become. Not because they lose value, because they lose distance. Distance allows imagination to participate. Reality doesn't. Reality has details, limitations, complications, maintenance. Imagination never includes maintenance. That's why anticipation often feels cleaner than ownership, cleaner than achievement, cleaner than arrival. The future edits out the boring parts. Reality puts them back in. And that's usually where the illusion begins to crack. You check the clock. Again. The habit survived every goal, every milestone, every version of the future you thought would finally be enough. The movement became automatic. You don't even notice it anymore. A quick glance, a small refresh, a silent calculation. How much longer? The question follows you everywhere. At work, at home, during conversations, during vacations. Sometimes even during the moments you spent months waiting to experience. That's the cost nobody talks about. Not the waiting itself, the attention it consumes. Because attention is finite. Every minute spent mentally living somewhere else is a minute unavailable to where you actually are. Not lost, redirected. The present rarely disappears all at once. It fades through neglect. A conversation becomes background noise because you're thinking about tomorrow. A meal becomes routine because you're thinking about later. An evening becomes invisible because you're already living in next week.
Thoughtful. The moment happened.
Your attention didn't. That's why some memories feel strangely incomplete. Not because they weren't important, because only part of you was there. The rest had already left. The future can be a useful place to visit. The problem begins when it becomes your primary residence, because eventually something strange happens. Life starts feeling shorter. Not because time accelerated, because fewer moments received your full presence. The days blend together. The weeks move faster. The years become difficult to separate. And then one day you find yourself looking back at a period of life that should have felt significant. A new job, a new city, a new relationship, a major achievement. And the memory feels thinner than expected. Not empty, just incomplete. Like reading every chapter of a book while thinking about the ending. You finished it, but you weren't fully inside it. That's the hidden cost of always preparing for what's next. You slowly lose access to what's now. I think this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because eventually, the future starts winning every argument. No matter what happens today, tomorrow always arrives with a better offer. A better possibility. A better version. A better outcome. The present can't compete with that. It was never designed to. The present isn't a promise. It's an experience. And experiences become surprisingly difficult to notice when promises are constantly interrupting them. There is a sentence that follows some people for years, sometimes for decades. It changes its wording, it changes its disguise, but the meaning stays remarkably consistent. When things settle down, that's when life begins. After this project, after this move, after the kids grow up, after the financial pressure eases, after the next promotion, after the next problem, after the next chapter. Then, finally, life. The strange thing is that the future never argues with this plan. It happily accepts every delay, every postponement, every condition, every new requirement, because the future never has to deliver. It only has to remain slightly ahead. That's why the promise survives. You don't need evidence. You only need possibility. And possibility is difficult to challenge because it hasn't happened yet. That's what makes the idea so powerful. The belief that your real life exists just beyond the current inconvenience, just beyond the current obligation, just beyond the current version of yourself. The result is a strange relationship with time. You start treating the present like preparation. Every year becomes a runway. Every season becomes a transition period. Every chapter becomes a preface. Always building, always preparing, always approaching, rarely arriving. Then something uncomfortable happens. Years pass. Not dramatically, quietly, the way they always do. And when you look back, you discover something strange. The period you thought was temporary became a significant part of your life. The job that was supposed to be a stepping stone, the city that was supposed to be temporary, the phase that was supposed to last a few months, the situation you were waiting to escape. That wasn't a waiting room. That was your life. That's the part that feels cold when you finally see it. Because life doesn't begin after the waiting ends. Life is what happens during the waiting. And if every chapter is treated as a bridge, eventually there is no destination left. Only bridges, one after another, for years. I think this is why the phrase "one day" makes me slightly nervous now. Not because it's wrong, because it's so easy to trust. One day I'll have more time. One day I'll slow down. One day I'll enjoy it. One day I'll feel ready. The future accepts every one of those promises without resistance. Reality doesn't. Reality quietly converts one day into calendar years, and most of the time, it does it without asking permission. The future didn't take over your life all at once. It negotiated, quietly, reasonably. One small exchange at a time. A little attention now in exchange for a better tomorrow. A little presence now in exchange for a better version of yourself. A little enjoyment now in exchange for greater enjoyment later. The deal always sounded sensible. That's why it worked. The problem wasn't that you planned for the future. The problem was what planning slowly replaced. Curiosity became optimization. Presence became preparation. Experience became evaluation. Arrival became transition. Even rest became productive. You weren't relaxing. You were recovering. You weren't enjoying the weekend. You were preparing for Monday. You weren't taking a walk. You were clearing your head. Everything needed a purpose. Everything needed an outcome. Everything needed to justify itself. And when every moment becomes a tool, something important disappears. Tools are useful.
Life isn't supposed to be one.
Some experiences are valuable precisely because they lead nowhere. A conversation that solves nothing. An afternoon that accomplishes nothing. A walk that improves nothing. A meal that optimizes nothing. The future struggles to understand moments like these, because the future wants results. The present offers experience, and those are not always the same thing. That's why waiting eventually starts replacing more than time. It starts replacing permission. Permission to stop. Permission to arrive. Permission to be here before everything is finished, before everything is fixed, before everything is optimized, before everything is earned. The strange thing is that most people never consciously decide to live this way. The pattern feels responsible, mature, reasonable, until one day you notice something uncomfortable. You have become extremely good at reaching the next thing, and strangely unfamiliar with being inside the current one. Maybe that's why some moments from childhood feel larger than entire years of adulthood. Not because childhood was perfect, because children haven't fully learned to outsource their attention to the future. They can still disappear into an afternoon, a game, a conversation, a random moment, without asking what comes next, without demanding a return on investment, without treating experience like a transaction. Somewhere along the way, many of us became managers of our lives and quietly stopped being participants in them. You spent years waiting for your life to begin. Not intentionally, not dramatically, just gradually. One future after another, one milestone after another, one promise after another. You told yourself that the important part was approaching, that the real chapter was coming, that the current version was temporary. The current struggle, the current job, the current city, the current season of life. Temporary. Just something to get through. But time has a habit that most people underestimate. It counts temporary things as life. Every one of them. The waiting counted. The preparation counted. The uncertainty counted. The ordinary Tuesdays counted. The weeks you rushed through counted. The years you planned your escape counted. Reality never agreed to pause the clock until you were ready. It never promised to begin after the next achievement. It never promised to start after the next upgrade. It simply kept moving, quietly, patiently, without asking where your attention was. That's the uncomfortable part. Life never refused to arrive. It arrived every day. The problem was that you kept treating the present like an obstacle standing between you and your future. And obstacles are not places people tend to look closely. So you kept looking ahead, 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 until one day you looked back and discovered something strange. The thing you were waiting for wasn't missing. The thing you were waiting for was happening the entire time. Maybe that's why the future always feels so convincing. It never has to compete with reality. It only has to compete with imagination. And imagination almost always wins, at least until the moment becomes real, at least until today becomes a memory, at least until another year quietly disappears into the archive. If Punchline Protocol helps you notice patterns that usually pass unnoticed, subscribe. Every week we explore another part of modern life that feels normal until you look at it closely. And if you're curious about the systems behind those patterns, Dark Side Protocol continues the investigation. The ideas are human. The narration is digital. The interpretation remains yours.